What pronunciation should you learn if your local friends say one thing and your teacher something else? How should you navigate the space between standard pronunciation and regional accents? Standard pronunciation will help you communicate, but regional accents might help you fit in. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about standard pronunciation in Mandarin and why you might want it. For some of you, this might sound obvious. Of course, I want to have correct pronunciation, so I'm going to aim for that. But then again, most Chinese people don't have a standard accent, so if you want to sound like the people you actually talk to, having a standard accent will not achieve that. It may also not be obvious what the difference between good pronunciation, correct pronunciation, and standard pronunciation actually is, if there even is a difference. And so we're going to talk about that as well. Before we go into that though, I'd like to mention that my pronunciation course is still open for registration. It closes again at midnight tomorrow. That's November 15th if you're listening to this in the future. And regardless of when you listen to this, you can always head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com for more information about the course. And if it's not open, you'll be able to leave your email address so I can contact you when it becomes available again. In the course, I teach standard Chinese pronunciation, which is nothing strange. Most courses do this, even though I do also mention some things about variation. However, I think it's important to think a little bit about what we mean when we say standard pronunciation or when we say correct or maybe even good pronunciation, because there are many ways of defining these things, and it is important to do things not just because someone tells you this is correct and this is not. Because sometimes correctness is not actually what you're after, although most of the time it probably is. This is not because standard pronunciation is good in and of itself, of course. It's good because it offers the best chances of communicating successfully in most situations. The purpose of this episode is to help you navigate the space between standard pronunciation on one hand and various different regional accents that you might also be interested in. So if your dictionary says 下载 for download, that's with 2 fourth tones, but everybody else around you says 下载with a third tone on the second syllable, does it still make sense to stick with a standard dictionary? And what if your textbook consistently uses nar and nar, but your friends all say 哪里 and 哪里? Should you still stick with what the textbook says? And finally, if your teacher insists that there is a difference between pinyin S and SH, so for example, sa and sha, even if you don't hear this when natives around you speak, should you still maintain that difference? These are some of the questions related to regional accents and standard language that I want to talk about today, but I want to make it clear that when I say accents here, I mean people speaking Mandarin with an accent. So maybe someone from Shanghai speaking Mandarin, or even someone from Beijing speaking Mandarin. They all speak Mandarin with an accent. So I'm not talking about topolects or what's normally called dialects, for example Cantonese or Shanghainese. That's a different topic and not something I'm interested in today at least. So since we're going to talk about standard language here, it makes sense to explore a little bit what this actually means. Because different countries and different governments have different approaches when it comes to language. So some countries, such as China, have a very clear standard for how the language is supposed to be spoken, and they also make a lot of effort trying to convince people that this is the way it's supposed to be. So, for example, you will not hear regionally accented Mandarin from news anchors on CCTV, and indeed they can be fined if they even deviate slightly from the standard. This standard is also used for proficiency exams for native speakers, so if you want to be a news anchor in China, or if you want to be a teacher, you need to pass a test that shows that you have acquired the correct pronunciation according to the standard. And the requirements for these groups of people is a bit different. It's higher for news anchors and a bit lower for teachers, but they still need to pass this test. Other countries deal with this rather differently though, so in my native Sweden, we deal with this in a very different way and we are closer to the opposite end of the spectrum. While there is something called Standard Swedish, this is not as codified as it is in China, and it isn't as prominent or important as it is in China either. So for example, on national TV in Sweden, you will hear broadcasters with different accents, and the idea that there is only one correct way of saying every single word in the language, and if you deviate from that you get fined, is a little bit weird here. The dictionaries that we do have are largely prescriptive, i.e. they tell you how people tend to use the language, not how they ought to use it. even though there are recommendations for how to speak and write to communicate clearly. But when it comes to accents, it's simply not the case that only one accent is correct and the others are wrong. The way we look at language like this matters a lot for a discussion about standard language, because in China, when you talk with Chinese people, they tend to mix these together. They think that good, correct, and standard kind of mean the same thing, and they are all related to the government standard. So personally, I would say that standard, which would be 标准 in Chinese, is the more neutral term and probably also the most accurate one, because saying that something adheres to a government-sanctioned standard is in itself not a statement about whether something is desirable or not. It merely states if it adheres to this reference or not. It's also good to keep in mind that there are different standards for spoken Mandarin. We have one standard, for example, in mainland China and another in Taiwan. And these are very close to each other, and in a vast majority of cases they say exactly the same thing. So if we look up most of the words, for example, they are indeed pronounced the same. There are some differences, usually with tones, but not that many. In practice, though, this doesn't help us much because, surprise, most people don't follow a government standard when they speak their native language. There is huge variation among different regions in China, and remember, I'm still talking about speaking Mandarin with an accent. There is also a lot of diversity when it comes to other topolects or dialects, but this is still about Mandarin. If you want to know more about this, we actually spent the entirety of episode 46 talking about regionally accented Mandarin, so check that out if you are interested. In practice, this means that almost no one you meet speaks perfectly standard Mandarin, so the only place you will hear it is on CCTV or in similar extremely official forms of communication, maybe on a Chinese proficiency exam, maybe in other educational materials sometimes. Language teachers with relevant degrees from China usually have a standard pronunciation as well, but far from always. And this is especially true if your teacher is from China but left China and then decided to become a Chinese teacher. Naturally, it also matters where the person is from, because some dialects are closer to Mandarin than others. So if you have someone from northern China, their pronunciation is likely to be closer to the standard than someone from, say, the south coast. Bear in mind that this is a broad generalization, and there are, of course, many exceptions. The vast majority of the population, they just speak the way their parents, friends, and co-workers speak, and they couldn't care less about an abstract government standard. Well, maybe they did care about it when they went to school, but that was probably a while ago. This is not only true for ordinary people, though, it's also true for the highest leadership. So Xi Jinping is actually the first Chinese leader that doesn't speak Mandarin with a heavy accent. So this means that there is a lot of variation, and when it comes to listening to Chinese, you should listen as broadly as you can, at least when you get past the beginner stage. You need to diversify your listening and be able to cope with the different accents. However, when you speak yourself, you are more in control and you can choose a target pronunciation. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So in essence, I think that the default approach should be to aim for the standard pronunciation, at least when you start, and at least for most people. I will come to these exceptions later, but let's look at why standard pronunciation is actually rather useful for us as adult learners of Chinese. Like I've already said, the reason we want standard pronunciation is not just because it is correct, that's the way it's supposed to be, etc. We're after more concrete reasons and indeed benefits for us as learners. So the first one is that standard pronunciation is more universal, and even if you're learning Chinese in a specific setting with only a few people, most students of Chinese actually want to talk with a wide range of people, and you might even know right now which people you will talk with, and it's likely that these people will come from different parts of China. In this situation, having a standard accent is quite good because it makes it easier for everybody to understand what you want to say. Naturally, Mandarin works as a kind of lingua franca in China because this is something that most people learn in school, or everybody learns it in school these days, so you can use it to communicate even if you speak different dialects that are not mutually intelligible. This usually then involves people speaking with a regional accent, and that is usually not a problem, at least if they are roughly familiar with the way the other person is speaking. And since this happens all the time, this is usually not a problem. However, this requires you as a student to be really good at your regional accent, because otherwise it's not just a regional accent, it's a regional accent plus your foreign accent plus some oddities because you're not a native speaker. And no one is used to hearing that combination of things, and that makes it harder for them to understand you, which is number 2 on my list here. Chinese people aren't used to your specific accent combo. So by removing one of the variables here and aiming for standard pronunciation, you make it easier for others to understand you. Number 3 is having fewer distinct sounds makes your Chinese harder to understand. So the purpose of language is, of course, to be able to communicate with others. And in Chinese, we already have a very limited set of sounds, so if you drop distinctions between certain sounds, your Chinese will be harder to understand. Again, like I've said, Chinese people can usually get away with merging certain sounds because people are used to the way they speak. They've heard people from Shanghai talking before, or people from Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. So they can deal with these differences. But you as a foreigner probably have other issues when you speak, and that means that removing anything that can be misunderstood usually is a good idea. So for example, even if people where you live typically don't make a big difference between, say, Z and ZH, so they might pronounce zha and za the same way, this doesn't mean that it's a good idea for you to do this. Of course, you don't need to overdo it if people you speak with don't, but I advise against merging sounds because it will make you harder to understand. Also, if you want to learn this distinction later, this becomes a lot harder. And speaking of the future, number 4 is that if you ever want to use Chinese formally, a standard pronunciation is often required, or at least beneficial. And most people don't learn Chinese to become Chinese teachers or to be on state TV or something like that. But if you need to show that you know how to speak Mandarin, being able to do so with a fairly standard accent is usually a bonus, if not a requirement. The 5th and final reason for acquiring a standard pronunciation is that, regrettably, many think that standard pronunciation simply is better or sounds more educated or some variant thereof. Like I said initially, this is closely tied to how you regard language, what approach you have to language in general, but it shouldn't come as a surprise that some accents are regarded as being nicer, better, more proper, more educated, and so on. And standard Chinese is, of course, the golden standard here. If you want to be all of those things or sound educated and so on, you need to have a standard accent. Of course, we can have lots of opinions about that. We can say that you shouldn't judge a book by its covers, and it's a bit silly to judge people based on their accents and so on, but it's still a fact that lots of people do this, and this is worth taking into consideration. Especially if you think that all accents are equally good, as it were, because most Chinese people probably don't agree with you. Personally, I have communication as the golden standard, and I think as long as people can communicate with each other, that's fine, and then exactly what particular accent you have isn't all that important. That's mostly said for native speakers who use this language, though. It's not necessarily the case that all possible ways of speaking Chinese are equally good. For example, when we foreigners speak Chinese, we make lots of mistakes and we have strong accents from our native languages or other languages we have learned. And this is certainly something that does impede communication. And then I would argue that these ways of speaking Chinese are then less good from a communicative point of view. I just think that it's a little bit weird to tell a native speaker with an accent that their accent is somehow not good. It's worth pointing out here that everybody has an accent. When we say that in English sometimes he speaks with an accent, it's kind of implied that they are deviating from a standard or from a few accepted standards, but of course the standard is an accent in itself, so everybody has an accent. This is even more true in China because there really are very few people who have a perfectly standard pronunciation. This includes Beijing accent, of course, which is reasonably close to the standard, but definitely not the standard itself. So as a learner, I think it makes sense to focus on standard pronunciation first as kind of the default approach. But then it's also perfectly fine to speak the way people around you do and adjust to a certain extent. This is something I think most people do naturally. For example, I have lived in Taiwan for 4 years, so I definitely have a Taiwan touch to my Mandarin. But on the other hand, I've also spoken a lot with people from northern China, so maybe nowadays my accent is somewhere in between. This means that when I speak with Taiwanese people, I go back to the way I pronounce things when I lived there, so maybe I reduce the differences a little bit between zhi and zi, for example. And maybe I use yin a little bit less, so that's the sound at the end of certain syllables, so EDN versus EDR. Then, when I speak to people who do this a lot, I tend to adjust and use these more myself as well. What I'm trying to get at here is that there really isn't a correct answer most of the time, or, well, the correct answer might be the standard answer, but is that really the best option to use all the time? That's a different question. There are also examples when the standard is simply out of sync and nobody actually says it the way the dictionary says it's supposed to be pronounced. My favorite example of this is a word that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode when I said 下载 for download, so that's 下载 with 2 fourth tones, which is how it's listed in an authoritative dictionary, but most people actually just say 下载 with a third tone on the second syllable. So, since the dictionary says 下载, should you insist on saying that even though nobody else does? Well, yes, maybe if you care a lot about some proficiency exam you're going to take, or if you just really want to follow the standard, but for communicative reasons there is no good argument for doing so. You just say what most people around you say and you will be fine. It's a little bit trickier when it comes to actual mergers, like I've said already. There are dialects where F and H, for example, are merged, so people might say 飞机 instead of 飞机 for airplane, and these mergers really make it harder for people to understand what you're saying, so I advise against them, even if people around you do merge these sounds. So in the end, it's up to you to decide what works best for you. If you are learning Chinese and have a strong connection to a specific region, it makes sense to start with that and then expand to the standard language later. A good example is if you've moved to a specific place, not specifically for learning the language, but for some other reason, and you're likely to be stuck there for a long time. Or maybe you just learn Chinese to be able to talk with your in-laws or something like that, and then it makes sense to speak the way they do. But if you attempt to learn Chinese in a broader sense to be able to talk with lots of people, the opposite probably makes more sense, to start with a standard language and then add regionally accented Mandarin when needed. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.